Hi, and welcome to Matt Holman Talks Mental Health, the podcast where I have the opportunity to sit down and chat to amazing humans about their stories and their journeys. For this episode, I'm so happy to introduce Penny Knight to the conversation. Welcome, Penny.
Hi.
Hi, lovely to have you. As always, I do a very brief introduction. I'll ask you to do a proper introduction to yourself in a second. But Penny and I, we both work in the similar space, actually, mental health first aid trainers or instructors, as we like to call ourselves. And yeah, very similar sort of pathways in terms of we've had corporate careers, which I know Penny will talk a little bit about. And now we're in this world of sort of mental health and well-being. But we came to this conversation because, as always, I love to hear stories and everyone's got a unique perspective. So Penny, thank you for joining me. Tell everybody just a very little introduction to yourself, please.
Yeah, of course, Matthew, and thank you for having me. Well, I'm 58. I've got two almost grown-up children, both of whom are neurodiverse. One's 20, one's just turned 17. And I used to work in the city, as I told you earlier. And really, I just wanted to share with everybody my experiences around my mental health journey, having never been diagnosed and never sought professional help myself, but how there are lots and lots of us out there who have these normal ups and downs of life and how we have managed them successfully. Um, and it becomes part of our life experience, really. So that's why I'm here today.
Oh, brilliant. And I found it really fascinating when we were sort of setting up for this, because often, as many of the listeners will know, the conversations I'm having are with people who have had a diagnosis and they've come through sort of a certain form of therapy or, process that they've been through to help themselves. And then the change in their sort of their motivations to change have really been interesting. So this is going to be, a different type of story again. But Penny, I'm just going to throw that over to you as I always do to my guests. Tell us a story, explore and explain, and give us your perspective of mental health. And of course, you're now training people in these last few years. So I'd love to hear more about where you've been and what's been going on.
Yes, so it is interesting because all around me, I mean, my mother has had, mental health difficulties her whole life, and it's never spoken about and never addressed, despite my encouragement. You can take the horse to water, but you can't make them drink, which is quite frustrating as an instructor, as I'm sure you're aware.
Yeah.
Um, but really, what I've always been kind of surprised by is the fact that I am a little bit of a head in the sand kind of a person myself, and yet I do get triggered eventually. And if we all know the stress container, if you don't address the different things in your life, you end up being overwhelmed and perhaps becoming ill. And I've certainly been in those places, and yet I've always managed to recover. So I know it's our own unique resilience or our own protective life factors and things like that. But I just kind of wanted to share a story from a long, long time ago to show how things have changed, um, and how, even as an instructor today, I experienced self-stigma, social stigma, around mental health at this time, and how that actually drove me to become an instructor many, many years later. So, do you want me to get started on the story? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I'm waiting.
So, I'm 58 now. I think I mentioned that earlier, but I was at university in the 80s and graduated in 1990. And for 7 years around that time, I was in a relationship with someone he's very, very generous and allows me to share this story. Um, and we're still friends. But as everyone can imagine, we have trigger points in our lives where we experience a lot more stress than we normally would. And obviously, university finals is one of those moments. And we were not at the same university. And as we were running up to finals, I was completely underprepared. Um, and it's a miracle I got a degree at all, actually, in the end. Um, but my journey through finals was actually missing exams, not handing in assessments. I mean, the list goes on. But he I had such little knowledge of mental health at that time, as I think most of us did. And it was a shameful thing, and no one spoke about it. And certainly, anyone of my age group will probably understand that. Um, but I became aware that something wasn't quite right. He came to visit me for the weekend, and it was nighttime, I remember. And he said that a tiger had chased him down the road from the railway station. Now, looking at that rationally, you would think, well, that's ridiculous. It can't be true. But I tried to rationalize it. I'm like, oh, it must have been a cat, and things like this. And then um, he tried to steal a train from Euston Station to come and visit me. And again, I didn't really believe the story. I thought maybe he was a bit drunk. I didn't really, I couldn't understand it. I couldn't understand why he was telling me these things. And I was so busy involved in my own anxieties and stress levels that I sort of just dismissed it and thought, oh, he's just, a bit drunk or he's a bit wasted or something like this. And I sort of dismissed it. And then all of a sudden, contact stopped. And, this is the day pre-mobile phone and everything.
Yeah.
And I couldn't reach him. And this was very unusual. And he had already actually, this is what I tell a lot of my learners, which is very interesting, about the physical symptoms being there.
Mm.
Um, he'd done his back in inverted commas, and he was actually doing all of his finals in his bed in his hall of residence. Now, in hindsight, there was nothing wrong with his back. That was just a manifestation of his illness.
Yeah.
But I phoned his hall of residence one day, and I'm sorry about the cat. And someone answered the phone, and they were a bit off with me. And oh, didn't you know? I'm like, what do you mean? What am I supposed to know? And he'd been sectioned.
Right.
And what had happened was he'd been standing on the top of his hall of residence, not suicidal, but thinking he could fly.
Wow.
So you know where I'm going with this, Matthew. And
Yes.
luckily his brother was there. Or I don't know how, I still don't know the full details of this story. Um, but his brother literally, you know, phoned the police and managed to get him to be sectioned. So, sorry, excuse me. I'm just recording something, darling. Okay. No, just walk past. Um, so he was sectioned, and no one had told me because they assumed that the reason he was ill was because we'd broken up. That was the only thing they could think of. Well, of course, that wasn't the case at all. So I then spent, gosh, months. I mean, I visited him in the hospital in London.
Mhm.
And of course, having no knowledge of mental health, in the middle of my own finals, the whole thing, it was this sort of perfect storm. And I'd never been to a section of a hospital before, for mental health patients.
Yeah.
And I was visiting him every day. And I didn't know who the nurses and doctors were and who the patients were. I mean, it was impossible to tell, believe it or not.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I figured out it was the people with the keys.
That's a good observation. Yeah.
Um, and again, he managed to escape from the hospital because just because people are unwell doesn't mean they're stupid, right? So he wanted to go to his end of year party, so he didn't know where he was. So he called an ambulance. An ambulance took him to the nearest A&E, and then he knew where he was and walked. So it's like in the middle of the mania. So he was diagnosed very quickly with what we now call bipolar disorder, but then obviously manic depression, which is also interesting because now that I'm an instructor, I can appreciate that it can take years for someone to get diagnosed.
Yeah.
Whereas his cycle had been so abrupt, so immediate, so up and down, and his cycles were very, very quick that he was diagnosed within about 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And he was then transferred to Northern Ireland, where his family live. And again, he escaped from that hospital as well. But was caught, he was walking home. So, that was a much less salubrious is the word I'm going to use, hospital. That was much more of the old-fashioned image of a closed ward,
Yeah.
and he was straitjacketed. They couldn't bring him down because he was enjoying himself. He was enjoying the mania. And you know, to watch him, he was, he thought he was invincible. He did think he could fly. And this is why they're dangerous, in terms of harming themselves.
Mm.
So the interesting from my perspective was I definitely was not well. His family were definitely, obviously, also not well, but we were all just trying to hold it together because our focus was on him. And I know my parents were very worried about me, but no one really said you need to go to the doctor, you need to go to the doctor. And even if they had, I would have said, no, don't be ridiculous. I need to focus on this. And even in the NHS, no one really tried to explain what needed to happen for him to get better, really. It was, all jargon that as people with no knowledge, we didn't really understand, and we didn't have the internet. We didn't have easy access to reference materials. So we were all just sort of flailing about, really. And it didn't really matter what the medical people were doing for him. It was only when it was no longer fun being manic that he actually began to get well.
Right.
And he knows the moment. He said he was banging his head on the wall because he was just so out of control, and that hurt. And that's when he realized he wasn't having fun anymore.
Right.
And that was the beginning of his journey to recovery. And I have to say that, as Dr. Deegan tells us, and I love her, recovery doesn't mean that you're back to who you were before. And he is a prime example of this. He was a very bright academic young man, and his life is very good. He has a long-term partner, he has a child, but he lives a very, very quiet life.
Yep.
He manages his mental well-being and his mood so carefully to make sure that he's stable. For a long time after his diagnosis, he was on medication and didn't like it, obviously. No one likes lithium, really. But every time he tried to come off it, he would become manic again. And eventually, he didn't tell me. And he did come off it secretly, and he was well. So I'm not sure what he does now. I think sometimes he does take medication when he has low mood. Um, but I don't really, it's not something we discuss anymore because it's not really a topic of conversation anymore
Yeah.
because his life is so good in every other way. So he's never did the, university career path that was predicted for him, but he lives a very happy life in a rural area and is well. And I'm so happy for him because, it could have been so very different. Many, many points in that journey where, if someone hadn't been there to stop him from self-harm, inadvertent self-harm and things like that, and with the support of his family, allowing him to rest and take his time. But the impact on me, was slightly different. I managed to recover myself. I had a very poor degree.
Right.
But that was not because of him, really. But I then later ended up working in the city, trading US equities. And this is where the self stigma and social stigma from that time came in. I was very close with the people I worked with, and I worked with the same team for like 3 or 4 years. And I never told them he was unwell.
Right.
I told them he was on the dole. So
Right.
they did not understand why I had a lazy, good for nothing boyfriend. And I didn't dispel them of that opinion. And it was only years later when I was doing the MHFA England 2-day first aid course
Yeah.
that all these light bulbs started going off. And I felt so ashamed of myself and my behavior at that time. But it was representative of society at the time. And so I say to people now, look, don't beat yourself up if that's the way you felt, because at the end of the day, it's all learning and it's all about how now by spreading that information and how being able to talk about it and being able to accept that we have our failings, historical failings for sure, and just making sure that you try and not make that happen anymore.
Yeah.
Um, so that's his story, really.
Yeah.
But his story became my story and helped me to then become an instructor in the end because it was on that 2-day course that I thought, right, I need to now
Yeah.
go out there and spread the word. And, I don't do it full time, Matthew, as you know, it's a part-time thing for me. Um, but it also now being an instructor and having learned all that stuff, it helps me to try and have a bit more of a word with myself when I'm low and make those little changes in my life, when things are not going well. Well, what can I do something about? What can I change? What can I not change? What do I need to put on that shelf and think, well, I can't do anything about that, so I must try and stop thinking about it. And maybe I need a bit more sleep. Maybe I need a bit, a bit more exercise and get some sunshine. And those little things definitely have helped me to stop becoming ill. And so really that's why I suppose I've never actually ended up in front of the GP
Yeah.
or getting therapy myself.
Yeah, you've done quite a lot of self-awareness, self-discovery in there, though, right? Through these conversations and through support
Yes.
others. And I think that's one area that we don't always talk openly about as well, isn't it? It's that the impact that the person that's struggling has on our well-being and our mental health. You
Yes.
mentioned that in there, that you were struggling, his family was struggling. What would that look like in terms of, what was that meaning to you when you say you were struggling? What sort of things
Uh,
do you think?
Not eating
Okay,
properly, not
right,
sleeping,
yeah,
very tearful all the time,
right,
just feeling helpless, really.
right.
And feeling helpless when where I'm coming from, Matthew.
I do.
When you can see someone else who is in trouble,
Yeah.
whether that's physical health or mental health, and you can't actually make them better.
Yeah, that's hard.
All you can do is give them that framework. And at that time, I didn't have a framework because I didn't have any knowledge.
No.
Um, and that's the thing, isn't it? I see people even today. A friend of mine had a son who had a terrible brain injury, and she was so strong the whole time he was in hospital. And then 6 months down the line, she just collapsed because she had been so busy keeping going, keeping going, keeping being strong for everybody else. And we were all kind of watching her in awe, and I was concerned, but what can you do?
Yeah.
Um, and eventually you will collapse. You try to be strong for someone else, but if you're not looking after yourself, eventually it all comes crashing down in a whole heap. And it did for me, but somehow I managed to get better. And I think partly, but obviously because I could see him getting better, and so the pressure started easing off a bit. Um, but yes, it's like why I can't explain why I managed to keep it together ultimately
Yeah.
when clearly someone looking at me knew I wasn't well,
Mm.
you
Yeah.
know.
Well, there's a lot of elements in there, isn't there? There's that resilience point, that your awareness, your adjust. We're not very good at making the adjustments before it becomes too bad. That's the challenge.
No.
That's sort of the journey when I went through my experience. It was like,
Yeah.
I didn't see it coming because why would I? It was very much we never spoke about it. And I find that fascinating. That's why I obviously when we were talking about this before we recorded, when you mentioned about sort of the early 90s to where we
Mm,
are today in 2026, what do you think
mm.
the differences? Just sort of summarize your thoughts around what do you think the differences are?
Look, there's still a lot of stigma out there. We know that, don't we?
Yeah, yeah,
But and still, I'm sure you're as frustrated as I am when I hear people on the radio and people in print on the news talking about mental health in a bad way, or in a way that I think now is, behind the times. I think the difference now is though we are talking about it, and I think it's it, people are more accepting of it. I mean, there's always going to be those people that don't believe it should exist, and and those are the people that are the hardest to change. But the reality is that my children certainly feel able to talk to me when they're struggling, whereas I couldn't talk to my parents, and my parents didn't know how to talk to me. I'd like to think that I'm more open and easy to communicate with. My children would feel that about me. And certainly, I'm very happy to share those stories of my life experience, saying, look, it isn't always, you're not always going to be happy. Sometimes you are just trying to get through the day. And, it's just about holding on to the fact that I can feel better. And I will feel better,
yeah,
and trying to maintain that positive thought. But it is so different, Matthew, isn't it? And I just think it's because we do talk about it more, and I do think there's more knowledge out there.
yeah,
Not in every generation. I mean, my mum still has no idea,
yeah.
you know.
Well,
Um,
yeah, we can't change everything, can we, in every,
No,
and I think
no.
it's a process of evolution, and it's the evolution of the conversation. And
Mm,
the fear is, I absolutely agree with you about stigma, and we still have this real issue around it in society,
mm,
many different reasons and many different experiences, and it's that we have the younger generation, as you said, your children, my children, and all those younger people who are learning more about the language to it. We didn't. And
yes,
that, we're in
yes,
we're in a more fortuitous position because of the type of thing we do, the work we do with
yes.
mental health training and supporting people. The reality is societally that isn't in place because
No,
most
I
people
agree.
haven't done it.
And the other thing is as well, as I'm sure when you have learners in your classes, that they still feel very reluctant to approach someone and ask about how they're doing and ask again and not just accept the glib answer. And I'm like, you know, I don't know if that's part of our Britishness, if it's part of our culture. I kind of feel that maybe in Italy it might be a bit more, out there. They might be a bit more shouty about it. I'm generalizing here, but I say, look, we've got just what's the worst that can happen? If you ask someone, what's the worst that can happen? They can shout at you, you know, or they can be offended. And then you just, you apologize, say, look, I'm really sorry. I've just been concerned. Maybe I've got the wrong end of the stick.
The
But
reason,
you
isn't it?
know, I would rather be embarrassed or be wrong than not ask, and then something gets worse, and that's what I always try and say to people. Look, I think as we've evolved throughout, eternity, we've lost those, we ignore some of our senses, and when you get that gut sense about someone, be
Yeah,
brave and ask about it, because even when my then boyfriend was first unwell, I just didn't really, when he was talking to me with those obviously grandiose thoughts and delusions and hallucinations and all the rest of it. I mean, now I would know immediately what was going on, that something was not right. But then I felt too afraid to ask him, even though why was I too afraid to ask? It's this sort of, it was so taboo then. And nowadays, I think people would say, well, hang on a minute, what do you mean a tiger was chasing you down the road?
yeah,
It, it has a tiger escaped from the zoo? Because if it
yeah,
hasn't,
yeah,
clearly, have you been taking any drugs?
yeah. Just trying to
Or
hang on, yeah.
something else is awry, something's amiss here. And maybe we need to get you some help, you know?
It's different, isn't it? And I think the fear is now the truth versus people being angry, because
Mm,
a lot of people I work with, and no doubt you've experienced in your journey as well, when somebody tells the truth, it's I don't know what to do with this. And I don't know
mm,
where to take this, and I don't know what I can say, or and you see that a lot, don't you? In society where we are now, people are always very scared of what they're going to say next because they're always worried that that will come back or that will
mm.
against them. And working with managers and leaders, and if they say that they haven't got a problem with their team, they just don't have the right things in place to help the team. So
Oh,
yeah, it's
it's
fascinating, isn't it?
infuriating. And
Yeah,
and it's like, but I try and say to people, look, there isn't anything right to say.
no,
The fact is, say that. I don't, gosh, I feel so privileged that you felt you could share that with me.
exactly, yeah.
And and actually, I don't have solutions to everything here, but the fact that you've shared it with me means that I can at least begin to try and support you, in whatever way that we muddle through. There's no, oh gosh, here's the solution here. I've got it in my hand. That's not always the case, is it?
Well, and I
I mean,
think
and I,
too worried about trying to fix it.
yeah, it's not about fixing. It's about making them realize that they're worth being listened to, and trying to give them back a sense of self-worth. I mean, you talk about managers. I was talking to a manager the other day about training some people in their organization, and the response I got was, oh, well, we've already got, 6 first aiders. And, to be honest, no one comes to us. So really, we're all too happy here. And um do I actually didn't even address it because I just thought, oh my goodness, I can't even begin today to tell this manager quite how wrong they are.
Yeah.
You know,
It's hard though, isn't it? Because you feel like you just want to shake them sometimes and say, will you wake up, and it's like certain managers saying, we don't have a problem with mental health in the team. And you say, well, why is that? And they say, well, nobody tells me they're struggling. And you're
Yes.
like,
And
okay.
and being a first aider isn't just about waiting for people to come through your door. It's about approaching others. And this is what's so infuriating, because when you're talking to an HR lead or something who's saying this to you, and you're thinking, well, have you grasped it at all? You
Yeah.
know, you're a first aider, and yet you're not even looking out
No.
for people. And
It's
asking the question in an appraisal is not really the right time,
but
is it?
but this is where sometimes that system is a struggle for people to understand what it means.
Mm,
If somebody
mm,
collapsed on the floor, do you not run to them? Do you not go towards them? Or do you
yeah,
wait for them to get up and come to you and say, "Oh, I fell over there"? And
yeah.
I'm thinking, well, this is where approach doesn't work. Approach is two directional, by the way, isn't it? And it's that,
Yes,
I'm
exactly.
sort of preaching that to people when I say approach. I'm like, you can go towards the person as much as they'll, and if you wait for them to
Yeah.
come to you, by the way, they're not going to come to you. So that's why they don't.
Well, although the thing is, they're going to come to you when they're more ill. And
Or
if the whole point, or if at all,
yeah,
but the whole point is that if you can intervene, early intervention promotes quicker and more complete recovery. It's another one of my,
love it. Yeah, yeah, it
you
does.
almost have to approach them before you're even sure there's a problem, because, it is really about that intervention being so early that they don't become, hopefully you can help them get better earlier.
Yeah.
So it is extraordinary, isn't it? And that's why there's still a lot of work to do. And the thing is, I'm by no means perfect. I have my moments of low mood, just like everybody else. And
Yeah.
you can have the knowledge and still not be well because of what life throws at you. And I do think that at the moment, with what's going on in society in general and the wider world, I think a lot of people are struggling. And all I hear from people is, where's the light at the end of the tunnel here? Everything is so, negative in the country today,
So
and it's
let's
about trying to get through it.
And you're right, and it is, and it's the hard reality that so many people are facing today. Everybody's got their own journey and their own experience, haven't they?
Mm,
Coming right to the end of this, Penny. It's. I know
good.
when I told you about the timing at the beginning, it's like, oh my gosh, you've got to talk for that long, and then you realise it's just becomes so natural, and it just keeps coming, doesn't it? So I'm going to throw it to you. Final thought. So
Mm.
maybe something you can think of positive in terms of the future, and also if there's a quote or something that you like or you want to share that you feel that works really well for me, or that's something
Oh,
you share to others.
well, I mean, it's very cheesy, and someone told it to me years ago, and it's hope, hold on, pain ends. And
Right.
I try to live by that myself. When I have a low, we all have our own go-tos, don't we? And when I'm feeling low, I try to say, look, you've had an amazing upbringing with two parents who, while flawed and with their own issues, loved you. You've got your health. You've had a great education. You were very fortunate to be born in the Western world. And I know that isn't something I would ever say to anyone else, because this is just what I say to myself. I have a word with myself,
Yeah.
and I force myself to smile. I force myself, because I read once that you use more muscles to frown than to smile.
Yes.
So, and forcing myself to smile just lifts my mood that little bit. And so I think, that works for me, but it's my thing. It's my thing, having a word with myself, telling me off. I would
Well,
never do that to someone else.
no, no,
But,
no.
you know,
Yeah, but if you pull that into your way of working, your way of
mm,
mode of operation, then if it works
mm,
for you, that's important as well, isn't it? And it's
mm,
it's so
yeah.
unique. Penny,
Feeling grateful for what I've got. Yeah.
100%. And we should, and I think,
Yeah.
we don't spend enough time looking at the positives. We tend to dwell on
No.
negatives, don't we?
Yeah. I try to focus on the positives. I guess that's at the end of the day what I try to do. Yeah.
Well, to be honest with you, Penny, this has been positive for me because I've loved listening to your experience and your perspective. No, I genuinely do. I love doing these because I get to hear a story. I love listening to stories. I love to talk as well, but I do genuinely love to hear stories. So, oh, we got a little guest there. Um, so huge thank you for joining me on this episode. I really do
Well,
appreciate
I hope
it.
people find it interesting. We'll see.
Yeah, no,
Really, really
definitely.
nice.
And people, when they listen to these, you get something out of something in there, no doubt. You may connect to a story or an experience or
Mm,
happened in your past, and so
mm.
why these are there. It's for somebody to hear something they needed to hear today in this moment. So thank you, Penny. I really do appreciate.
Thank you.
I wish you all the very best for the future as well, and in continued positive journey, of course, as I always
It's
wish people.
always a pleasure to chat with you, Matthew.
Thank you. Look after yourself. Take care.
Thanks. Bye bye.